I'm really interested in understanding how primates, especially great apes, are adapting to living alongside people that can actually help to develop kind of mitigation measures to reduce their impact on local communities.
Welcome to State of the Earth, the podcast from the Graduate School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Exeter in Cornwall. Here we explore the issues shaping our planet's future and look at how we can make a positive difference through advances in technology, conservation, science, business management, and more. I'm Sofia Salas, your host for this episode, where I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr Kimberley Hockings, Associate Professor of Conservation Science at the Centre for Ecology and Conservation at the University of Exeter. Dr Kimberley Hockings is a conservation biologist with a focus on primates. She holds several important positions, such as co-director for the Cantanhez Chimpanzee Project, and is a member of the IUCN SSC Primate Specialist Group's section on Great Apes. Her research and experience covers a wide range of topics from primate behavior, conservation projects, and zoonotic diseases. In this episode, we'll discuss these topics, Kimberley's journey in conservation, the importance of human-wildlife interactions, and the growing role of technology and AI in conservation. There's a lot to explore here, so let's get started. Hi, I'm joined by Dr. Kimberley Hockings.
Hello.
So, could you give us a little bit of background into how you first got into primate conservation? Like, what first attracted you to that field?
So I did my undergraduate in zoology at the University of Liverpool. And I went there knowing that I loved animals and I was fascinated by great apes. And I was lucky enough to do my third year dissertation on chimpanzees grooming, actually, at Chester Zoo. And how feeding period kind of impacted their grooming behaviour. So it was a really interesting project, and it basically paved the way to do a PhD. So I went straight from undergraduate to do a PhD. And it was either a choice between St Andrews or Stirling, and I wasn't too sure. And then I got the opportunity. My supervisor in Stirling said, right, you can go to Guinea if you'd like. And it's a really fascinating site, these tool-using chimpanzees at Bossou. And so I was just sold on that, and it's kind of gone from there, really.
Yeah, amazing. So what is, in your opinion, what's so interesting about studying primates? What can we learn from studying primates?
Yeah, so, I mean, lots of different taxa are really interesting. So don't get me wrong, I'm not just only interested in primates, but they are an interesting order to study. So what I think is different about primates is in terms of the different academic areas where people research them. So again, psychology departments. So we look at primates because they're our closest living relatives, and maybe especially the non-human great apes. Of course, we are a great ape, humans. So the non-human great apes, we can learn about cognition from them. From an anthropological perspective, again, because we're part of the same order, we can kind of try and draw some inference about if some of their behaviours parallel maybe our early ancestors' behaviours. And so we've got some quite interesting behavioural studies on things like food sharing that were once thought to be uniquely human, but we see across the animal order. And so we can start to kind of ask who's sharing with who and what are the drivers of food sharing, because it's kind of a pinnacle of what we do, and kind of vocalizations and language and all this stuff. So it's really, really interesting from that perspective. So my research does focus mostly on great apes, and from a conservation perspective, they're all threatened with extinction. So the subspecies of chimpanzee that I work with, the western chimpanzee, is critically endangered. So from a conservation perspective, they are an important group to work with. They're also kind of charismatic flagship species. So that's why they are quite interesting in multiple different ways, actually.
Yeah, definitely. And your work is very interdisciplinary. You combine a lot of different things, as you said. So you did talk a little bit about the behavioural side of primates, which is something that a lot of people are drawn to. So can you, for like listeners who don't really, they're not coming from a science background, can you explain why understanding primate behavior is so important in their conservation?
Yeah, so, to be honest, sometimes I think that the role of behaviour in conservation is overplayed.
Right.
So you quite often read research articles that, for me, doesn't really have anything directly to do with conservation, and then there's a couple of sentences on the end, like tagged on, oh, this is really important for conservation. I'm kind of like, well, why? So it's a really good question, actually. There is a whole field of conservation behaviour that's opened up, and we've got many people in the centre interested in that, work in a different taxa. So again, it's not just about primates. But from my perspective, I'm really interested in understanding how primates are adapting, especially great apes are adapting to living alongside people. So how the ways in which they're changing their behaviour can actually help us understand how they're changing it, but also try to develop kind of mitigation measures to reduce their impact on local communities. Great apes and many other primate species are really behaviourally flexible. So that means that, and ecologically flexible, if you think about baboons, they can survive in rainforests, they can survive in deserts, like just feeding on underground humans. So they're so flexible. Chimpanzees are really flexible as well, not quite to the same extent, but they are able to utilise these kind of complex agricultural forest mosaics alongside people. But that does bring them into conflict with people through feeding on crops. They're big, they can be scary. Children can behave erratically around and run off, and sometimes we do get attacks. So I like to understand how chimpanzees are behaving in these landscapes to try and better inform kind of conservation measures to protect them, but also make sure that you're trying to protect people's livelihoods and the safety of little kids, for example.
So what kind of interactions do you see the most, human-wildlife interactions? Which are the most common? Like, which brings the most conflict, or which ones are cohabitation?
Yeah. So there is a growing field of human-wildlife conflict and coexistence. We're moving away from the term conflict a little bit because it infers that all interactions that people and wildlife have together are negative, and it's not true. But conflict is a part of coexistence, the way in which humans and wildlife are adapting to share the same space, and it's dynamic over time, it changes. So negative stuff is an important part of that, but we also got neutral interactions and positive interactions. I can talk about actually large body carnivores, for example. So the ways in which they are seen to behave negatively, so problematic behaviours, is like livestock depredation. So the classic you always hear about, kind of lions feeding on livestock, and a way to prevent that is kind of creating these bomas to keep livestock protected at night. In the case of primates, one of the main ways really is through crop foraging. So we know that kind of agricultural development is a main threat to biodiversity conservation. So you see these agricultural landscapes kind of expanding because people need to grow food to survive. But what that means is that primates that are very adaptable are encountering these foods and adapting their diet to incorporate them, often because they've lost natural resources. So I would say crop foraging is a major one that's persistent, so it's on a regular occurrence. But as I kind of touched upon earlier, actually one of the main threats, especially with kind of large-bodied apes, is through attacks. So yeah, I've experienced it firsthand where I've been in villages and little children have been attacked, and I kind of, how would I feel if my kids were just playing in their back garden or climbing a mango tree and getting food, and an animal attacked them? I mean, it's terrifying. So those kind of less common. So it's we're talking maybe once a year, twice a year, depending on the site, but it can have a really long-lasting impact on those local communities, which is completely expected. It's completely understandable. But it's terrifying. So it's understanding it from the local community's perspective is really, really important when trying to think about how to mitigate these issues.
Yeah, definitely. So what kind of work have you seen or maybe taken part of that sort of tries to change these attitudes, or maybe tries to help locals in an effort to help conservation?
So one thing I always try and point out to when I'm talking about this subject to people is that actually in the UK we are incredibly intolerant of the wildlife we live nearby. Maybe in some areas these attitudes are changing a bit, but we're so intolerant we can't. We don't tolerate badgers in our back garden or foxes. There's always questions about, and even in other parts of Europe, they're very intolerant of wolves, for example. And so as a starting point, what I see is, especially where I work in Guinea-Bissau and many other parts of West Africa where I've worked, and East Africa as well, people are incredibly tolerant of having all these large-bodied, like I said, potentially dangerous wildlife living nearby. So that's kind of an important starting point, I feel, just to kind of make... So one, and also I don't really like talking about kind of... some people talk about educating people. No, there's lots of local ecological knowledge about the wildlife, their behaviours. There's lots of knowledge within communities, and people generally know how to behave. The problem is that the wild areas are shrinking, villages are expanding, and so there's just more pressure on people and on wildlife. So they're going to be interacting more regularly, and so that's just a natural occurrence when you've got reduced space and increased numbers. And also, we should say, when conservation measures are actually successful and wildlife numbers are increasing, sometimes that can actually put more pressure on the system as well, because conservation is working. So there are various strategies that you can use, maybe if we think about directing kind of education towards children. So one thing that I'm actually involved in now with it's an IUCN group, Western Chimpanzee Conservation Alliance, and we've just got the funds actually to develop a children's book. So a very simple idea, but one where we've worked with several experts across Africa thinking about how can we teach kids how to behave around chimps, because what happens, kids in where I work in Cantanhez National Park and other places, they just kind of walk around in groups. They're very free. It's not like very controlled situations like we have here where kids don't tend to wander around. So yeah, very free, but often they are encountering wild animals. So for example, chimpanzees, kids are attracted to, say, a mango tree, chimps are attracted to a mango tree, and that's just a recipe for disaster. So this book will hopefully teach kids how to behave when they encounter chimps, how to stay calm. The worst thing you can do is all run and panic, and often the little one gets left behind, and often chimps will just display and will run off. But if they are provoked, if stones are thrown at them, then they're often thinking about protecting other chimpanzees that are there. So it's a difficult situation, but yeah, we hope that this we'll try and evaluate the impact of that when we go to different schools, see if it kind of changes kids. We can see it increases their knowledge. It will be difficult to monitor if it actually results in a behavioural change. Like, we're not going to start putting kind of fake chimpanzees in the environment and monitoring that, and we can't follow chimps. But we'll hopefully kind of increase knowledge of how you should behave if you encounter a chimp, and hopefully that should kind of help in that sense a little bit.
You mentioned it before just now, how because urban areas are expanding, there is sort of increased tensions, and also there's other issues that come along with that, such as disease, which you have a role. Actually, you're very involved in all the diseases that to do with primates. So can you tell us a little bit about what diseases are looking like in the primate populations currently?
So that's something I didn't mention earlier, is that because primates are primates, so we're related, they share many of the same diseases that we can get. And so depending on which primate species you're talking about, so we have, for example, in South America, many species have yellow fever, for example. We know that in other areas we get primates with SIV, which is closely related to HIV. They can succumb to many of the same respiratory viruses that humans get, and that's why it can be so problematic in a tourism sense, having such close proximity between mountain gorillas and tourists, for example. And so the list is vast. We know that chimps can get polio, and quite often these diseases are inadvertently introduced either by researchers, tourists, just living very closely to local communities, and it's a real challenge. And that's actually why we've decided not to habituate any of the primates in Cantanhez National Park, because we feel that the risks of disease are just too high. We did recently identify leprosy in chimpanzees that we work with in Cantanhez. And actually leprosy is a really interesting disease, but it affects chimpanzees in a very similar way to people. It's a very stigmatized disease because of all the physical symptoms. But it was once thought to be unique to people until they identified it in armadillos in Central and South America. And then also there's a form of leprosy in squirrels in Brownsea Island, which I didn't realise, which is actually in Dorset, very close. I went there on a school trip when I was younger. So people often joke that I'm maybe like some super spreader or something like that, but no, I don't think I am. It's just a joke, but it's kind of coincidence that it happens in my hometown as well. Yes, it's a very stigmatised disease. It produces these similar physical symptoms in chimps than it does in humans, and we know very little about it. So they think it's spread through aerosols, but they don't know if it's also spread through the environment, through insects. And so for such an old disease that's talked about in the Bible, we know very little about it. And that makes it difficult to say how the chimpanzees acquired it. Mm-hmm. We also know that baboons in the landscape that is shared by chimps also have it. So to try and understand those kind of disease transmission dynamics, we've done molecular analysis as well, and also looked at kind of historical interactions. Again, we still aren't 100% sure, but it likely spread from people to chimpanzees centuries ago. Possibly maybe a pet chimpanzee was kept by someone who was suffering from Mycobacterium leprae, the pathogen. But it probably does not represent a threat to people in the current situation, in the ways that people are interacting. But as we do know with armadillos, that as soon as hunters that are exposed to infected armadillos actually have quite high antibodies, which shows that they're being exposed to the pathogen and their body's responding to that. So it is problematic because some local people where I work do eat other animals within that landscape, including baboons, and we know that baboons are infected. So again, it's about going to say to people, these are the facts. I'm not telling you what to do, what not to do, but these are the facts. Then this is a route of potential transmission. Just be careful.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So some really interesting case studies. So tying that into sort of primate behavior, have you noticed any changes in response, like anything that they might be doing in response to this increased pressure from the disease? Or do you think there'll be maybe in the future?
So if I'm kind of, trying to think about, for example, how leprosy might impact chimpanzee behaviour, it's very difficult to say. I mentioned earlier that we are not habituating chimps, and to understand behaviour, you need to think about maybe ways to observe an animal closely. Because we're not following them on foot like I did for my PhD, I was like in the forest for 12 hours a day, same distance we are apart now with chimpanzees, monitoring everything they did. And we can't do that. You can only do that if an animal's habituated. So what we've got at the moment is a kind of a camera trap set up. So we get these kind of snapshots of what individuals are doing, and we can understand. It's obviously a systematic design, and we're using quite complex statistical analysis to analyse the data, but you're able to look at kind of space use and who's with who at that time when they're crossing in front of the camera trap. So from that, we're hoping to, if I get funding, to do some kind of maybe social network analysis to see whether infected individuals are kind of central or peripheral to the group, and to answer questions like that. But we are somewhat constrained because we have chosen not to habituate. Right. So for the good of the animals, but also, it means that you have to think outside the box a little bit, and you have to process these massive data sets. So at the moment I've got loads of undergraduate students and master's students working alongside my PhD students kind of processing these images. But actually, in the future, one of my PhD students, Katie, is actually hoping to kind of develop these AI models to process all the images automatically to help us kind of keep on top of it because it's so labour intensive.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, you've just segued really nicely onto a question I had about AI. So you recently co-wrote a paper with Katie Murray and Dave Hodgson. So I think that's the one that you might be referring to.
Yeah, exactly.
So I wanted to ask a bit about what you think the limitations of this new technology are in conservation. Like, where can we blend technology with conservation strategies, and when does that not actually benefit conservation? So, share your thoughts.
So my opinion is that people think differently, but conservation is about people now. So we need to understand what wildlife are doing. I touched upon that with the behaviour side of things, but actually to to really develop long-lasting, sustainable conservation strategy, it's all about working with different conservation stakeholders. And when I talk about stakeholders, I'm talking about local communities, I'm talking about government organisations, I'm talking about non-government organisations like some of the NGOs that we can think about, WWF or Jane Goodall Institute, or anyone who's working alongside. And then we conservationists, researchers are another stakeholder. So there's all these different people in the mix. And the more you get into conservation, the less time I spend in the field following chimps and collecting the data, the more time I spend in meetings and discussing strategies and how do we use this information to develop conservation strategy, and making sure, like I said, the people at the forefront of the issues and who are suffering because of, not just suffering, but have basically are impacted by living alongside wildlife, making sure that they're part of the conversation, and it's not just this top-down approach to conservation. So it's making sure people are integrated into the development of any conservation strategy. And it's time-consuming. You're working with different cultures, different languages, trying to make sure you understand everything that's going on, which is dynamic, fast-changing. Things change so quickly depending on kind of social and cultural contexts and political contexts and economic contexts. So you need to understand what's going on with people. So that's at the forefront of everything. AI, for me, it's useful when I'm thinking about, like I just mentioned, processing these, it's transforming how we're monitoring biodiversity. And that can be really critical for integrating within conservation strategies. So like I said, understanding how biodiversity is changing over time, for example, where we're seeing kind of increases or decreases in the abundance of different species. We can set up all the technology we want, but if we can't process the data, it's quite meaningless. So a lot of people are finding that they've got this bottleneck and they've just got all this data and they don't know how to process it. And then so that's not helping them to understand kind of changes within the landscape from a biodiversity perspective. Some other research in terms of monitoring people. So again, this is quite ethically complex and you need to be very careful with it, but actually you can monitor kind of gun noises or other things, activity within the forest. Again, it's ethically quite sensitive, but that is happening in other places. I'm quite interested in whether we can use AI to kind of predict what might happen under different environmental and social change in the future. So imagine you've got your 10 square kilometre site. You've got people and wildlife moving around this landscape, and you're able to put this into a model, and you're able to kind of change, for example, where the agriculture is being grown, or make some predictions about climate, how that might change in the future, or the cash crop, the value of the cash crop changes, like for example in Guinea-Bissau it's cashew, and how does that change how people are using the landscape. So if we can use AI to kind of help make these predictions, for example through the use of like digital twins or something, that would be really cool. So again, but that's quite academic, and you'd need for it to actually, it's part of conservation science, but to actually make a difference on the ground, you would have to somehow integrate that into any conservation strategy on the ground, working with, again, would always involve working with your local stakeholders. So it's a tool, AI is a tool, as is all this technology, and it's really cool and I love it and it's exciting, but it's not conservation. Conservation's about actually working alongside people.
Yeah, really well said. So just to finish up then, I had one question, and that is, what sort of gives you hope for the future of conservation? Because you hear all these negative things, and people are very stressed about what the future might look like, but you're out in the field and you're working with people, so what sort of gives you hope for the future?
So there is a massive movement of conservation optimism, and I think it is kind of what you've said, it's about celebrating the small successes. We know there's things that are outside of our control. We can't control the global political chaos that we're seeing now. That, for me, that feels kind of outside of my control, and so I can't let that drag me down too much. I know that it depends maybe on how you kind of view that personally. It's your personal choice. But so what I do know is we can make a small difference. We're training local guards on the ground. We're working with our local research assistants. We're training the next generation of conservation scientists in Guinea-Bissau, and also train some part of the I'm Programme Director for the Conservation and Biodiversity MSc here in the Centre for Ecology and Conservation. And so I feel I'm playing my part in training the next generation of conservation scientists. Now, if I come at all of that with negativity and like, well, what's the point? You know, let's do the ostrich effect, stick your head in the ground, don't worry about it, just get on with your lives, you know, just try to ignore it, then you're not going to make a difference. I know that by trying to kind of inspire and make people feel that they can, however small, like make a difference in a positive way, then the world will be a better place compared to if those people weren't there. So I think there is positivity. There is, what gives me hope is when I go to Guinea-Bissau and I see these young, kind of passionate Bissau Guinean scientists who've got so many ideas and are just so switched on. That's what gives me and the rest of our Cantanhez Chimpanzee Project a lot of hope for the future of conservation. Also seeing, for example, the government institute that I work alongside, the Institute for Biodiversity and Protected Areas, Aissa Regala, we both were doing fieldwork at the same time in Cantanhez. She was studying forest elephants, she's Bissau Guinean, and I was studying chimpanzees, and she's risen to the top. She's now director of the Institute for Biodiversity and Protected Areas, and she is a force of nature. She's amazing, and that gives me hope. So in Guinea-Bissau, I see all these really incredible people coming through, and as well, like local communities want to protect their forests, want to protect their biodiversity, and they're willing to do a lot to try and make that a reality. And also in the UK, like I said, the master's students, the undergraduate students who are so passionate about conservation, and yeah, everyone will find their role to play. And I think it's important not to give up hope and just to keep pushing it. You get told that you can't do this, you can't do that. Oh, it's really competitive. Oh, you can never work with great apes. You can never work with big cats or elephants. You can never get that job, but you just can't listen to it. You just have to keep doing it and not listen to those negative voices. Otherwise, you won't kind of be able to follow your passion. So, yeah, that's kind of how I view the world.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. It's been a really interesting conversation, so thank you for speaking to me.
No, my pleasure. Thanks ever so much for the invite. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to keep an eye out for the next episode of the State of the Earth podcast.